Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of the Argument Clinic. I'm Martin, and he's
Lawrence.
And together, we're the hosts of the Argument Clinic, a bi-weekly podcast about Lincoln Douglas debate for everyone, whether you're a seasoned veteran of the tournament scene, a novice just going to their first tournament, or just someone who enjoys the beautiful and pleasing sound of Lawrence's voice. Then this is the podcast for you. Now, where in the world were Martin and Lawrence? I know that I was at the Catholic Forensic League National Tournament, where two of my students reached the elimination rounds, and they were eliminated. One in the runoff round, and one in the double octos. But they were seniors, and it was really great, and it was really sad to see them at some of their last tournaments. But despite being really sick, the CFL National Tournament was kind of fun as it is. Lawrence, and I also just played in a trading card game tournament, so that's nice.
For 11 hours. 11 hours of Magic the Gathering.
That was only because I was winning. I lost in the finals, which is very sad, but not actually that sad. I get much sadder when I lose at like debate tournaments than at Magic tournaments, because Magic tournaments you can just get unlucky and lose, and it's like whatever. But at debate tournaments you just feel like everything's your fault all the time. Sadness. So Lawrence, what have you been doing the past 2 weeks other than looking around your hotel room and wondering why I'm not there?
Well, I'm not in a hotel room. I'm at home. But no, I mostly
that was your first mistake.
Yeah, mostly just doctor's appointments, taking care of all the things I didn't bother to do during the school year. So yeah, nothing exciting, unfortunately.
Okay, so on to two more clerical issues. First of all, send us emails at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. We got some emails ahead of the CFL National Tournament after the podcast for that one went out, where people like asked us for various things where we had found evidence and stuff like that. So you can feel free to email us with any questions or random memes that you have that you would enjoy us seeing. So feel free to email us at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com with any questions. Second thing is Victory Briefs. So Victory Briefs is a great summer institute. I'm not sure if you can still go sign up for camp there, but you probably can. So those are in there are a bunch of camps in July and August. And if you really want to take your game to the next level going into the next calendar season, VBI is really a great place to do that. Okay, now on to the substance of the episode. So this is a scholarship episode. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the National Speech and Debate Association topic. We're going to be doing a topic analysis for their resolution for the national tournament. The national tournament is in a few weeks, so we want to give you all enough time to really feel extremely prepared going into that tournament. So we have a guest who will introduce after we get back from our break. So Lawrence, you competed at the National Speech and Debate Association at least one time and did okay. Is that right?
Yeah, so I qualified my freshman year in public forum debate. Insert public forum jokes, why it sucks now. Congress, my second time, actually.
Congress!
And then LD my junior and senior years.
Okay, so did you ever surpass my junior year record of 5'7"?
I did. So my junior year I was sixth, I think, and then my senior year I won it.
Okay, so is that better than 5 and 7 ballots?
I think mathematically speaking, it has to be.
Okay, well, I'll let those number crunchers at home figure that one out. So after this break, we'll introduce you all to our very special guest, who we're super excited to have on the podcast, and then we'll get straight in to the topic analysis for the National Speech and Debate Association. All right, so it's time to introduce our special guest, Alex Yoakum. How are you, Alex?
I'm doing well. How are y'all?
Y'all is excellent. I assume y'all refers to me and Lawrence as a collective. Lawrence, how do you feel the collective of us is feeling?
Doing pretty good. Not in school, just sitting around doing nothing most days. Pretty good.
By the way, speaking of the word y'all, I say you all a lot just so that I don't say y'all. I just don't want to ever bring myself to do it, but it's like in my vocabulary.
Well, I'm from Oklahoma, so y'all is totally natural. And Alex, you're from Texas, so
Yeah.
you also can say y'all, right?
Yeah,
I'm
y'all
from
is
Florida.
a key part of
I still get to say that, but I like can't bring myself to do it. I still like, but it's like it is a thing in my vocabulary that would make sense. I just don't say it. So I just say the more inefficient one. It's a huge tilt. Anyway, back back to back to real issues. So Alex, you did debate for, was it Grapevine that you debated for?
Yeah, I debated for Grapevine for my sophomore through senior year, and then I did a little bit debate elsewhere before that.
Okay, so you did mostly student congress, right?
I did not. I did
Aw.
this thing called LD debate for a while.
That's unfortunate. This is actually a
Yeah.
student congress podcast. I'm sorry, you're off. Okay, so one of the reasons that you're on is that, in addition to you just being a fantastic young gentleman, is that you wrote a topic analysis for some external brief organization about this resolution, right? The
Yeah.
National Debate Association tournament resolution.
Yeah, I did. I did lots of research on it, and I put together a topic analysis for a brief. And I thought it was pretty good, despite me rushing to put it together. But you know,
Yeah, rushing to put things together is just like the way of student life. I don't know. Okay, I'm not going to go down that tangent. Okay, so Lawrence, do you have any special words that you would like Alex to hear before we before we get straight into our topic analysis?
No, I think we're good. Let's just jump into this.
Okay, excellent. So as we've done in all the other topic analysis, this topic analysis is divided into 3 parts. So first, we're going to go down phrase by phrase, word by word in the resolution, and talk about just the meaning of the resolution. What does the resolution require us to debate? What are the objects in it? A good understanding of the resolution and the points of clash in the resolution is one of the most important things to succeeding at the National Speech and Debate Association tournament. And my statement about the CFL National Tournament was borne out as I judged lots of rounds, and a lot of those rounds were decided on how much you knew about the resolution. So then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about strategy, specifically strategy for the National Speech and Debate Association tournament. What should your strategy be at the tournament? And then the third thing is we're going to discuss 3 arguments on each side. We're going to discuss 3 affirmative arguments and 3 negative arguments. And then we're going to go to the end step. We're going to tell you to send us emails, and then we're going to have the only real important segment of the podcast that everyone listens to is the mini debate segment. Okay, so to get right into it, the resolution. So I'm going to say this a couple times so that those of you that aren't like at that aren't looking at anything in particular can have access to this. I'm going to say the resolution a couple times, and then we're just going to go it sequentially, phrase by phrase. So the resolution is resolved: a just government ought to prioritize civil liberties over national security. Again, a just government ought to prioritize civil liberties over national security. Okay, so first words in the resolution, a just government. So this construction is a little strange. It appears sometimes, but it's a little strange to see just like the subject of the resolution being involving a normative term. And what I mean by that is, so the word just, right, is a moral term. It involves, considerations of justice. And the word ought is also in the resolution. So this resolution kind of has 2 sort of semi-moral terms floating around there. And when I was a debater, did not debate many topics with a just government just in the text of the resolution. So Alex, did you debate many of those? And how would you think that it would change how you would approach the resolution? And then afterwards, the same question for Lawrence.
Yeah, so I actually debated a couple of these topics my senior year, I think. And one of the interesting parts about this resolution in particular is which will probably be a question of like what types of asks or what types of questions the resolution is trying to answer, is whether or not this is a resolution about a general philosophical principle, or if this resolution is more about a particular instance of a just government taking some action, and whether that's consistent with our notions of morality or justice. And the way that this can be interpreted in two different ways, I guess, is off of the Article A, because it can both be used to refer to a specific type of thing, as well as a broader sort of universal statement. So whenever you're approaching the resolution, depending on which definition or which route you take can kind of lead to different conclusions. If you take it as a universal statement, then the question of whether or not this is about a particular government being consistent with our notions of justice would be the interpretation of it, right? And we could talk about things such as specification, or not talk about things such as specification, sorry.
Speaking of the specification thing, so in your mind is like a plausible reading of the resolution that when someone says like a just government, they mean like a specific one. So for example, the AF is like, I think that the resolution is talking about Singapore. And this debate is just about civil liberties laws in Singapore. Is that sort of what you're thinking about?
So I think that's definitely one interpretation that could be consistent with it. There's a lot of debate within linguistics and logic about the function of the Article A in terms of whether it's an existential statement, so referring to a particular instance of a thing, or if it's a universal statement, as in it's making a broad generalization about things. I would say that both of those interpretations may be valid, but personally, I'm leaning more towards the universal instantiation of the Article A, mostly because the actor itself, just government, is sort of a broad sort of class of things or identities, and so whenever we're talking about such broad classes, I think the Article A kind of changes in context, and so it's more about a universal statement as opposed to an existential interpretation of the topic. But depending on where you draw from, like linguistics or logic, some may argue that the existential interpretation is the proper one in this case. And there's a lot of like complicated like linguistic stuff that we don't necessarily need to go into. But
so like, seizing on one thing that you said earlier, it is like pretty clear that the resolution is intended as sort of like a very vague statement, right? I mean, Lawrence, tell me if like this is kind of a good substitute for like the type of thing that a just government is in the resolution. So a just government is kind of like saying like a good citizen, where like a good citizen should do this, or like, a good father would do this.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely
and then
think...
and then it doesn't mean like, Lawrence's father. Like that's not what the resolution means, right?
Right.
Like,
and in sort of any common usage, if you just tried to substitute any particular good citizen in for a good citizen, so you're like, a good citizen would be Lawrence. Lawrence ought to do X. I don't think anyone would sort of would intuitively accept that as sort of a reasonable conclusion to draw from that. I think most people, the common sense or the common usage of it is definitely just more generic, like it refers to any given or like in general.
I think though, and like, guys, you maybe like back me up on this. I think the like more important thing here is that like this is just not a debate you're going to get into at this tournament, right?
Right, and that was what I was about to.
I mean, the National Speech and Debate Association tournament is like not really a tournament where someone can just, read an AF about South
Singapore.
Korea,
yeah,
and just like talk about that for the whole time, right?
Right, and
I mean, Alex, you could still use examples from particular ones, right?
Right. Yeah. That's what I was about to say. Just because you take a more generic interpretation of the resolution doesn't mean that you can't use particular examples. It would just mean that you wouldn't be able to say a particular government does something. And I think that another interesting thing that debaters might capitalize on, or at least something that a lot of debaters did when I debated these topics my senior year at both local tournaments and a couple of national tournaments too, was to use like the just government part to exclude some examples. So for instance,
Yeah.
you would say like, oh, well, X government has done some bad thing by, prioritizing national security over civil liberties. And then the argument would be that, oh, well, they're not a just government, so, or something along those lines. And I think that that argument might come up a lot, but I don't think it should be I don't think it's a particularly good argument in context of this resolution, other resolutions that use just governments, mostly because the type of justice that you're appealing to is kind of contingent on, or what a just government is contingent on what moral theory you're appealing to. And it's more likely than not, you're not going to find too many like deontological governments or like.
Okay, so I'm gonna say two things about that. About two specific things that you've said. So first thing was about the whole, like, you can use just governments to exclude random examples. So by the way, and this is to you too, Lawrence. Based on my experience at the CFL national tournament, I believe that many people will make this argument. Like I think that your examples are not about a just government will be very popular. What do you because so like just as a heads up, so at the CFL national tournament, Lawrence, do you remember like the topic analysis that we did about that?
Unfortunately, I do.
So do you remember that one argument that was like government's need for secrecy means they actually need the secrets?
Oh yeah,
that argument was so popular.
Was it? Oh, ooh, that's disgusting.
It was. Yeah, like a bunch of the random like sketchy things we were talking about, like the random sketchy, some of the random sketchy interps that were like followed from the resolution, right? Like, and there was a lot of balanced arguments on both sides. So like those like interp issues arguments and the government need for secrecy argument on the neg, like those were like very popular. And I imagine that similarly, the whole just government excludes your examples as a way of getting the debate to be more vague. I imagine this will be a very popular argument on on probably the affirmative and maybe the negative. So like, I mean,
like, I don't, those examples weren't popular when I debated what was functionally this topic, but reversed my senior year because it was specified in the United States. But just sort of as a, having judged a bunch of lay rounds between, then and now, I predict that at least a good quantity of debaters will be making arguments that use the example of just government to exclude arguments.
Yeah. So that thing that you said, Alex, like even though it seems like a little sketchy and a little misey, I actually think people are going to do it a lot. So it's definitely something that like our listeners should be aware of. Yeah,
I definitely think people are going to do it a lot because your experience at in CFL Nationals and both my experience as like doing debating topics with like just government my senior year, a lot of people made that argument to exclude a lot of the particular examples or the context that people would talk about in order to kind of get around some of the common arguments of the topic.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I can imagine like a cross-examination sort of hypothetical one going like this, right? You would say, like, you would like have a bunch of examples, and then your opponent would be like, so is your argument that the United States is like a perfectly just country? Because I mean, like, look at the things that they do to the following other people, and then you're like, I guess they aren't the just government. It's like, well, how about Britain? It's like, oh, well, they did this messed up thing, and then I can imagine, me being like, so what actual example like do you want? And I think the answer would be something like, it's not like this is not about like a particular just government or whatever, or even examples from just governments. It's just asking us a hypothetical just government, like what rules would it have, right? Like think about it in like a sort of like a like, a little bit of kind of like a social contract way. Like you're setting up society, and it's like, what rules do you want? Right? Do you want a society that prioritizes civil liberties over national security? Like, if you're thinking about what a just government would have, like, would it have those things? Anyway, so do you all? Okay, so we like sort of need to move on from this a little bit because it's just like the first word of the resolution. But I did want to say one more thing about something that you said, Alex. So you said that sort of a just government, like that, is kind of tied to your moral theory. So I am. In a lot of contexts, I would agree with you. I'm actually not sure, though. Like, the way that I've seen justice as a concept, and Lawrence, you have a lot more experience with this than I do, but the way I've seen justice debated as a concept, it's been a lot more concrete than just a synonym for morality. Like, it's been a lot about like benefits and burdens distribution and stuff. And a lot of people kind of assume a meaning of justice, which has to do with like something related to fairness in the criminal justice system that isn't just reducible to a moral theory. But please let me know if I'm wrong about that, because I'm just talking about my experience judging at like CFL Nationals and like random locals and stuff, and I don't know if it's accurate.
I think you're pretty spot on there. I don't think every debater sort of does this, where they take the time to distinguish between concepts of justice and morality, but because there's certainly a bunch of debaters who still conflate the two. They're just like, justice is morality. But yeah, I definitely think that your points do matter for a lot of debaters.
Yeah. So Alex, are you sort of on board with the thing that I'm saying? I mean, like, obviously, like, justice and morality like are linked, right? I mean, like, it would be pretty difficult to argue that like a thing that was like extremely unjust like was moral.
Yeah, so I understand where you're coming from, and I guess I kind of agree with you to the extent that justice isn't necessarily the same as morality. But I will say that different concepts of justice exist. So, for instance, so within the context of like, Rawls versus like Nozick, they have different ideas about what constitutes justice. And so the idea of maybe certain forms of justice, like distributive justice, not being like that cool, or the idea that like consequentialist forms of justice, where the ultimate result is what determines whether something or not is just, or, I mean, in a different sense is moral, but in this context, just, can kind of change what we mean by what a just government is. And even so, like, there are different types of like social contract theory too that can tell us the foundation of what the state is. So I think you told me a little bit earlier that y'all had focused on the social contract in a prior episode, but there's a difference, I think, between like a Hobbesian social contract, for instance, and like a Lockean or Kantian form of that political philosophy. So I think that in some instances there is an assumed definition of justice, but I would also kind of caution to say that this couldn't necessarily be extended universally. There are things that we can certainly say are unjust on face, but when we get into particular situations, it's harder to distinguish what exactly is justice between two different parties.
Okay. And then this actually segues really well into the very beginning of the question, which is, you were talking about how, so it is a little awkward, right? That kind of like what you think a just government means kind of depends on your criterion a little bit, right? Which kind of interprets in a little, in some ways, what theory of justice / morality, and in a lot of cases, those will be similar things, that you actually want, right? Like, the criterion might, the fact that you have a criterion might change the meaning of a definition in the resolution. I'll ask this to Lawrence first. Lawrence, how do you recommend dealing with this issue that I've described? Like, would you want to is the best way to rigorously distinguish justice and your moral theory?
I mean, my honest advice is that, like, while certainly interesting and something worth thinking about, it's probably never going to be a developed issue in any given debate at nationals.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like my advice is like be aware of this issue if someone challenges you, but certainly I don't think this will be a popular argument or point of contestation in any given debate.
Okay. And by the way, listeners, so we're spending a lot of time on this word. That's because a lot of there are very few words in this resolution, and a lot of them are easy. So I do want to talk about one more thing, though. So I want to circle back to the argument we were talking about, where sometimes someone will say a just government means that the government is basically perfect, which means you can't use examples and stuff, right? So one variant of this argument is that a just government just does not have problems, right? Like, in order for government to be in order for a government to be just, it means like the government is like acting really well, and it's like not really abusing people's civil liberties that much, right? Or like, it's generally like a benevolent sort of thing. So I can imagine some people will use that form of argument to kind of try to get out of some of the nitty-gritty of the resolution, because, let's imagine some affirmative is like, hey, lots of governments are doing some messed up stuff. And then like, your opponent is like, that's not what the resolution's about, because the resolution is actually only about where the governments are already just. So that doesn't sound like a white way of reading the resolution. Lawrence, how would you recommend someone would attack this argument? And to recap, the argument is just governments, just by nature, like do not really abuse their citizens, so that really is not a problem that we should be worried about in the resolution.
I mean, like that just seems so obviously silly to me that I'm not exactly sure how I would attack it in a debate sense. I mean, like the reason that seems silly is because, I mean, a just government is certainly, well, because one, we're most likely debating about some sort of what a hypothetical just government do. And obviously that begs the question of the resolution. And also that to imagine a just government as one without problems is also kind of silly, since the negative merely would have to bring up any conceivable example of an instance where civil liberties and national security might be in tension to sort of take that assumption out of play. So
that's also true,
wouldn't worry about it too much.
Yeah,
that's an overarching theme in most of these things about the wording of the resolution. You should be aware of these complexities, these nuances.
Well, actually, I think people are going to make this argument a decent amount of the time. Like that,
right.
That argument I just made. So, but I do think Lawrence was spot on there, that like one of the primary things that you want to say against this is like the resolution is asking us to set up a just government. It's like, hey, if we wanted a just government, how would we set up its rules? And so the idea of saying like, oh, well, a just government already would not, mess up their citizens. It's like, that kind of begs the question of the resolution. We're trying to decide exactly how much abuse of citizens the government should be allowed to get away with in the name of national security. And also, in a funny way, that argument, which is a negative argument, is like kind of admitting that the affirmative is right a little bit, because they're like, governments can't abuse citizens. That would make them unjust. It's like, that seems like an AF argument. But anyway, okay, so we've spent a long time on just government, but this is a very strange phrase, and we want to make sure that you all are abreast of all of the weird things that can go on with this phrase. Okay, the next words in the resolution are ought to, and these words are, we've had them many, many times. They just mean something like pretty vague normally, right? Like it's like a vague moral obligation, moral demand, stuff like that.
Yeah, just moral obligation, desirability. I think the only point of interest I mentioned in my topic analysis, which Alex, you can add to this later, is just that like some people might define it as logical consequence, where it's just like this ought to fall off the table if I push it. That is a silly interpretation of how ought should work in this context, because we're obviously, none of these are logical conclusions. We have to debate about the merits of civil liberties versus national security. So just don't let people define it like that, and you're fine.
Yeah, Alex, I also think that it's stupid. Do you think it's stupid?
Yeah, I've never really been a big fan of ought as logical consequence. The only thing that I'll add to ought is that some people might define it as just like expresses obligation generally, and make some argument about why the question of the resolution is about governmental obligations in particular, in order to exclude more abstract moral theories, such as like like more abstract moral theories to be used to make the framework, so to speak. And so they would use that as a reason why their particular framework ought to be preferred in terms of whether or not it's most consistent with or specific to the actor in this case, which is the government. So I used to make similar arguments to that, which is just that obligations are context specific. And since we're talking about governments, we have to look at governmental obligations in particular. And that could flow into more of a social contract type argument, or an argument in which we have to consider more broadly, like what is the government's, like what balance does the government have to strike within its political obligations to its citizens?
Yeah. I mean, like the resolution says government in it already, right? Like it's just like so government, like there's no way you can avoid talking about the government on this topic, right? I mean, regardless of what definition of ought you use, the government is just in it, right?
Yeah, my argument more so is just that some people tend to use more abstract moral theories or justifications for moral systems. And so their argument would be something along the lines of we have to prefer justifications in the framework that are specific to the government as opposed to individuals.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But those are, yeah, okay. I got you. Okay, so the next word, sorry. The next words in the resolution are in sort of different places. I'm going to like combine them. So the next part of the resolution, all of it is, so prioritize civil liberties over national security. But I want to talk about prioritize over. So prioritize over, like that's just like in the CFL Maths topic analysis, we have the words valued above. Those are just like those just mean the exact same thing, right, Lawrence?
Yeah, there's of the terms to be worried about trickiness happening in the resolution. I'm not sure if prioritize over is one of those ones that we ought to be particularly concerned about.
But there is something that, we said a lot on that topic that's also true on this one and that bears repeating. And Alex also mentioned this. So this resolution, like the CFL Nationals resolution that we already had a topic analysis about, talking about valuing something over something else, prioritizing something over something else. And one thing that we talked about for a very long time here, and we should probably repeat because it's a very important way of understanding the resolution, is that the affirmative is not obligated to get rid of national security entirely, right? They just have to prove that in a fight between civil liberties and national security, civil liberties at least barely wins. Right, Lawrence?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like pretty much, like I think we should all agree on this. It's like pretty common. Like if I say I prioritize the life of my family over the life of, some random stranger, I'm not saying life of random stranger doesn't matter. It is not a relevant consideration, et cetera, et cetera. It merely means that if forced to choose between the two, I would, try to help my family over, some unknown stranger.
Yeah. So Alex, you mentioned, I think you said you used the word balance to describe what's happening here. So the resolution asks us to strike a balance in favor of civil liberties, right? So how do you imagine that this balance argument will work on the affirmative and the negative? The affirmative is obviously going to be like, I don't have to completely get rid of national security, and then the negative will say, I don't have to completely get rid of civil liberties, right? Like that's how this is going to go down.
Yeah. So I think what y'all were talking about is pretty on point. Basically, the resolution implies a conflict between these two terms, and just when there is a conflict between these two, choosing one over the other. And so that's the basic way that I take it to mean prioritize. And within some of the topic literature, most of the discussion about the conflict between civil liberties and national security talks about specific contexts in which these values come into conflict, and reasons why valuing one over the other is more important in that context. It's definitely not in the sense of like, oh, absolutely, civil liberties must always come before national security. It's more so that we can have both, just that one or the other, when there is a conflict, must come first.
Yeah. I mean, like the resolution has a pretty like this is I'll just like say this now. So the civil liberties, national security stuff, like this is the quintessential political theory conflict, right? Like this has got to be number one.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, this is what like this is. it was kind of funny. I was talking to Lawrence about this. This topic is what most topics are kind of secretly, right? Like,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
so like a lot of topics are secretly this topic, right? Like so many topics are like civil liberties versus national security, but in disguise. Like,
Right,
so like, for example, like this the CFL national topic, like the AF was like democracy is good, and then I was like security is good, and that was like every single debate. So
Right.
like I mean that was literally just like we should be able to do the things we want, and the negative is like, but sometimes we're not safe.
I mean, and like, in fact, this topic is so popular that it is virtually just a rehash of the 2014 Nationals topic, just with the sides flipped, and that's it. Because really, the age-old question of government, beyond whether it should exist or ought to exist, assuming that it ought to exist, the only question is, where is the balance between individual liberties and sort of the collective good? And this is just that question. It's the one that's been attempted to be answered by every political philosopher for the last century or two. So yeah, it's really just every other topic.
Yeah, I mean, like, and Melissa, one of my students, broke at the CFL national tournament, and she was neg a bunch of times, and her neg was just like Hobbes' social contract: security is the best 100% of the time. Just like, so it took the hardest possible stance, right? It's like a not very balanced approach neg. It was just like, hey, government's got to do what government's got to do. Screw civil liberties, right? But so it's possible to take really hardline stances, but most of the time you should take a very similar stance. And a person that I judged who ended up winning the tournament, I don't know, with this argument, she actually lost on the merits of this argument when me and Mr. Herzig, who was on our last episode. So random tangent. So listeners, the guy I was doing the topic analysis with, Chayton Herzig, for the CFL Nationals, we were on a panel together at CFL Nationals, and we voted the same way each time. It was great. But so in that round, the neg this is transitioning me into the next way that I don't think we actually really talked about, but I saw multiple times at the CFL National Tournament, guys. So it's kind of the negative balance argument. So we only sort of talked about the affirmative version of it, but one version that I saw was this, and let me know, Lawrence, if this is like, and then I'll ask Alex, let me know if this is like a thing that you necessarily expected. But one thing that I saw people doing is saying, actually, they should just be equal. And then they were using that to say, like the neg would say, they're equal, which means that, the resolution is requires the affirmative to say that one is better than the other, and it's not. They're both just the same, so vote neg.
Yeah, so the balance approach is incredibly popular in Oklahoma for some unknown reason on any topic that requires like a person of two values. The reason that I don't find it particularly persuasive is merely because I don't think that it's sort of a logical possibility. So assuming the two things are actually in conflict and one of them prioritizing one necessitates a trade-off with the other, it becomes nearly impossible, and I would argue actually impossible, to imagine a world in which it is possible to give equal weight to civil liberties and national security, because one must, by definition, in a world of a conflict, give way to the other. So it's kind of impossible for that to happen. And
one thing that I saw these people arguing, and this is what both of them argued, was that instead we should just decide it solely on a case-by-case basis every time.
Yeah, so that is, I guess, the stronger approach to this argument, but still also not particularly convincing to me, because by doing so in those case-by-case basis, you have to pick one that has sort of relative value over the other, and it doesn't seem to be at all the way that we sort of make decisions in the real world, because the way that you would sort of do it, I guess, using the sort of most common example of NSA surveillance, if you're let's balance these civil liberties and national security such that they are somehow valued exactly equally. What policy does that translate into? I mean, I still don't understand how that could possibly work. And even if you did it on a case-by-case basis, I'm still I still think that inevitably it would be required that you assign a greater value to one of those, to either national security or civil liberties, in your calculus, because it's impossible to give them exactly the same weight.
Alex, I kind of want your you to weigh in on this. What is your opinion of this like negative balance argument? I know I like heard it a couple times and it seemed to be pretty successful, but and Lawrence said it's reasonably popular. Lawrence isn't convinced. I mean I voted in the round in the 2 rounds that I judged at CFL Nationals. One of them, the affirmative just accused the negative of reading a counter plan and lost on a 3-0, and in the other one, the affirmative argued that that the resolution was not a categorical statement, and therefore that this negative argument affirmed and won in a 2-1. The affirmative one. So, what is your opinion on this?
I largely kind of agree with Lawrence on this. I think that there are definitely ways that this argument can be phrased a bit better. I actually saw, whenever I was reading, I can't remember what article it was, but when I was doing research for this topic, that some people or political theorists make arguments that in like ideal like governments or just governments, these things don't conflict or duties don't conflict in the same sense. So if we're just talking about like in the very abstract ideal sense of like what governments are and like whether or not their fundamental duties conflict or ought to conflict, then maybe there might be some grounds for this argument. But I think that a lot of Lawrence's criticisms are probably true for the argument that it's just kind of hard to imagine a policy or a way in which there would be just a perfect balance between the two. And even in the case-by-case basis one, you're still striking a balance in favor of one or the other, just in a case-by-case basis rather than just taking a hardline stance on which one comes first.
I mean, and also like the case-by-case basis is just kind of like a cop-out, because like when you actually have, I think like what the resolution is asking is like, when you actually have to make the choice, right? What are the sorts of things that you should think about? So like, for example, if I was like, I want to prioritize like meat over carbs or something when it like comes to diet. And if Lawrence is just like, I want to do it on a case-by-case approach. And I'm like, okay, Lawrence, like, so here's a hamburger, here's spaghetti. It's like, that doesn't help you at all. Just be like, I'm using a case-by-case approach. It's like, yeah, what are you thinking about?
Yeah. I'm also not sure how strategically this argument would make much sense, because you'd still, in order to win the debate as the negative, right? The affirmative would read arguments for why civil liberties is good. Well, the negative, in order to say, hey, we have to take the balance approach, would still have to read arguments that are like national security is good, but then limit the strength of them so that they aren't technically reasons to prefer one or the other, but just reasons that they are balanced with the affirmative. So It seems like they would just have to neuter their own arguments in order to make this a viable argument. Like, if you really think about it, and that just doesn't seem to be.
Yeah. I mean, like, to be fair, right? And so, like, to be fair, if successful, this argument does neutralize most affirmative arguments, because what the negative. So, like, it as a trade-off to making your arguments worse, you also get rid of a lot of theirs, because what you're saying is like, hey, all of those examples of when civil liberties are good, yeah, we should do it those times, but like maybe not other times.
Yeah, well, so I mean, that just leaves the rest of the debate the same, which is civil liberties versus national security again. So if you sort of if an affirmative is smart, it also
does not play well with others. And what I mean is that, and what I mean using that sort of weird turn of phrase is that it doesn't work well with other arguments, like, because it kind of directly, because again, as Lawrence says, you can't make this balance argument one of your contentions, and then in the next contention just be like, national security is the best 100% of the time. Right? I mean, like, because then they're like, you don't want to balance. You said that, first you said they're equal, and then you said this one's way better. Like, you just aren't actually like you can't say both of those things. And then the last thing about this, so the reason that I don't like this argument is that, and the reason that this argument lost in the debate that I judged was that I think it assumes a certain view of affirming the resolution, which isn't necessarily warranted. So, for example, in this debate, what the negative was basically saying is the affirmative has to, remember that the negative is like, let's do it on an ad hoc approach, right? Now, if the affirmative just says, why can't I recommend that we do it on an ad hoc approach, but just like, do mine a little more, right? Because like the national security stuff is more important less of the time, civil liberties is important more of the time, then what I think a lot of negatives will say is like, well, you're the AF. You have to say that it's true every time, right? And I just think that that's false. Like I think in order to affirm the resolution, you don't have to say that every time, like one thing is valued over another thing. Not in every single case. That's kind of what the balance argument's supposed to be about, right? It's like, I mean, it favors one over the other, but it's not like a timeless judgment that applies to every single thing. It's just like, in general, we should do this.
Right, and so let's. I can just go back to the sort of family example. When I say prioritize the life of, like my mom over the life of a random stranger, well, say that there's like, 5 random strangers to be saved, only one mom. Well, even though I would generally prioritize the life of my mom, that is only sort of a prima facie or just like on face reason to prioritize the life of my mom, not a reason that it would exclude the consideration of every other instance or factor that could be morally relevant in that instance. So while generally I would prioritize the life of my mom, there are definitely circumstances in which I would not. And so similarly in this topic, the affirmative,
I'll let her know.
would generally, protect civil liberties, but could easily grant negative exceptions that are like, yeah, there are a few instances where we can allow national security to take precedence.
You heard it here first. There's sometimes that Lawrence would not prioritize his mom over something else. So I think that's what I'm going to get from this segment. And if you have any angry emails to send us about Lawrence's lack of regard for his family members, feel free to send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. I'm sure Lawrence would love to read them, or I would love to read them and laugh at Lawrence. And I'll probably read them.
I would never prioritize your life above anyone else's.
Oh man, rough beats. Okay, so now that we're done with that word, let's talk about civil liberties. So, my understanding, just based on
being a citizen,
just based on United States law and like the way that words are used, I'm not sure if this is true globally. So my understanding is that civil liberties are different from civil rights. Is that correct? That civil liberties refers to your ability to go out and do something, kind of like positive rights. And then civil rights are more of like or is it the opposite?
I think it's a little bit flipped. So I think, Alex, you could also answer this question, but civil liberties seem to be really just more negative rights, like things that the government cannot do to you without at least a stringent due process. So these would seem to include freedoms to like protest against the state, freedoms to reasonable expectations of privacy, freedoms to to speak without being censored by the government, things like that. Whereas civil rights seem to be more related to sort of equity, justice issues, most notably concerning race-related issues in recent American history, and like civil rights movements for that. So it seems flipped from what you were originally saying. But Alex, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I only want to add just a little bit. Lawrence is mostly right on it, I think. Civil rights just kind of concern your basic right to be free from unequal treatment based on like immutable characteristics like race, gender, so on. Whereas civil liberties are just basic rights and freedoms that are often guaranteed by the state in which you're kind of allowed to do things. So within the Constitution and interpreted by the Supreme Court, we have rights such as like free speech, privacy, due process, and the right to vote. Those are all
we meaning Americans, by the way.
Yeah, we meaning Americans. And those are different civil liberties that we are kind of guaranteed access to, which means that those are kind of like, that's kind of like the substance of what civil liberties are, just basic rights and guarantees that the United States or constitutions kind of give us to do things. They kind of act as negative rights in some sense because it's kind of like in the context of the United States, the right to free speech, for instance, is considered a civil liberty, and the government is not allowed to interfere with that right to free speech. Whereas civil rights can also be construed as negative rights because it's also like the government may not, or a civil rights violation is kind of triggered by you being unequally treated. So it's freedom from that unequal treatment based on an immutable characteristic. So now civil rights violations can come from a systematic denial of civil liberties to some extent, but they're both kind of positive rights and negative rights to some extent.
Yeah. Okay. So, so we've talked a lot about like civil liberties generally. Let's talk about national security generally, and then we'll talk about the conflict and the resolution, and then we'll move on to our next thing, which is strategy. So I think national security is like a like a very easy concept to break down. Security, obviously, your ability to defend yourself. And when it says national security, it is the defense of the nation, right? So both of you, like, this is obviously defense of nations from other nations, right? I mean, like, it wouldn't be like would it be a national security issue if there was like some guy who was like, I don't know, like, is a coup a national security issue? Sort of.
I think anything that threatens the well-being of a substantial portion of a nation's population should be considered a national security threat, be it, sort of external aggression or even just like things like economic stability. So I guess a coup would count under that sort of interpretation of national security. I'm not sure why that's I'm not sure if that'll be a frequent example. Like, I think most people sort of just accept national security as referring to like what we commonly consider to be national security threats as it's used in the news.
But I'm just trying to understand, like, to actually unpack the concept, right? I mean, like, it is defense of the nation, and I think often implied there is like from external threats.
Right? I'm not sure if it's just external. Like, I don't know did you like look up definitions for this, Alex? I mean, because the problem is that there is no singular definition of what national security is. I mean, even Wikipedia will tell you that.
Yeah, the most basic definition that I found was the safety of a nation against threats such as terrorism, war, or espionage. And considering, like, depending on how you define or what tactics the coup would use, potentially, like, domestic terrorism would be considered a national security issue, at least the way construed, as long as it's construed as like an existential threat to the well-being of the nation.
Oh,
so I think
okay.
I think that what's could be distinguished here from national security is something called personal security, which is just like basically the idea of security, but applied to individuals. It's like the uninterrupted enjoyment by a man of his life, his body, his health, and his reputation, or that was unnecessarily gendered, but a person of their life. But in this sense, then, like, national security only concerns like existential threats to the nation. And one way that I kind of distinguish this in my topic analysis would be, like, for example, the resolution would not be concerned with like the violation of Fourth Amendment procedures in like a particular criminal homicide investigation, but it would likely be concerned with due process protections extended to suspected terrorists, because terrorism is considered a national security threat, and civil liberties like due process would be in conflict with that national security at interest.
So I think that I got it right. It is like violence aimed at the nation state entity, right? Like no matter like where it is. Like if I am just like, I want to blow up like the US government, right? Like that would be a threat to national security because I'm endangering the system of the nation as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good way to characterize it.
Yeah, so okay. Now that we've talked about national security and civil liberties, so I think the conflict is like sort of obvious, but Alex, would you like to sort of walk us through where, in a very general sense, those conflicts usually appear?
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion in the literature between conflicts between civil liberty and national security kind of focus in a couple of particular areas. So the first one is I think this was a topic a while back, but in regards to the government's ability to surveil its citizens in order to prevent things like terrorism or other national security threats. And a lot of people argue that one of the civil liberties that ought to be guaranteed or that exists is one of privacy. Another instance in which the conflict between the resolution kind of conflict and resolution kind of occurs is with due process protections in particular areas. So, for instance, the United States has argued for the suspension of due process for those suspected of terrorism and put them through military tribunals for a period of time. And so the justification there is that national security is more important than ensuring the due process rights of those outside of the nation. And more generally, most of the conflict more generally just deals with whether or not individual liberties should be like sacrificed in the name of the greater goal of safety of the citizens. And so within that context, then there's kind of like a lot of very particular issues that come up within this sort of conflict. And those are just like a couple of examples of them. There was also another interesting way to kind of view national security, which is the way that national security is often constructed is often kind of contextual to the state. And some of my research that I did on like just the definition of national security issues or what constitutes a national security issue was I found this article and it talked about how the United States has actually constructed immigration law as a national security issue, and that as a result, there's been a conflict between the due process rights of immigrants within the United States, particularly their due process rights and their rights to like live and subsist in the United States have been degraded in the name of national security. So a lot of these kind of talk about like conflict between liberty and national security in a more general sense, but you could also think about the more contextual ways in which national security has been defined to kind of create that conflict where we wouldn't think that it's a particular national security issue.
Okay, Lawrence, do you have anything to add to that as far as like different scenarios, ways of thinking about the general conflict?
No, not really. I think that was pretty comprehensive. If anything else does pop up, I think it'll be better addressed in sort of talking about the specific arguments for the affirmative and the negative in the later sections. So,
okay, well, if you have any interesting questions about just meanings of words in the resolution, feel free to email us at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. And when we get back, we will start our next segment where we're talking about strategy at the National Speech and Debate Association tournament and strategy on this resolution. Okay, so in this segment, we're going to talk about how to approach this tournament strategically. Strategy involving a broad swath of things, like what you want, what sort of prep you want going into the tournament, how should you be debating at the tournament, what are the sorts of things that you want to be thinking about. Lawrence has done, as I've mentioned earlier, far better than me, about as far better than me as it is possible to do, literally the most possible that it's possible to do at this tournament. The only time that I went, did pretty miserably, and Lawrence is the master and like got 6th and 1st. So I'm gonna completely turn over the reins to him. But so this is organized into two different things. So the first thing we want to talk about is, for those of you that want to know, how should you debate at the National Speech and Debate Association tournament? Just generally, not about the resolution, but just generally about like the tournament of National Speech and Debate Association. Lawrence and Alex, but starting with Lawrence because he has the most credentials. How would you go about debating it? That I don't know necessarily that it would be different from something else, but like, what are the sorts of things you should really have in mind when debating at this tournament?
Yeah. So I mean,
judges, etc. And then I'm just
yeah.
I'll
So like, there's a bunch of general tips for like how to debate lay. I think like a while back I wrote an article about being sick with a lay or whatever that you can Google and find, and that contains I think a lot of the sort of more general advice. So I'll talk just 3 quick points about I think the key things you need to know about nationals. So the first thing is that nationals pulls in judges from all across the nation, from a bunch of different places with different experience levels. One story I like to tell is that my junior year in round 12, my panel was someone who did not flow because they had barely judged debate ever before. One person who flowed horizontally because they were sort of just like a local coach who only knew how to flow horizontally, and then one person who flowed vertically, who was clearly the most experienced judge of them all. And all 3 of them voted for me, but for relatively different reasons. Like the reasons they voted negative on the flow were, or on their ballot, were different. So like the person who didn't flow was like, I thought the negative sounded better. The person who flowed horizontally was like, I thought the -1 key point. The person who flowed vertically was actually analyzed all of the arguments and like gave a more coherent reason for decision. And the thing is that's not a bug of nationals. That is sort of the feature of it, that you pull in everyone from across the nation. So when you're debating, I think it's really important to recognize this diversity in both of geography and in experience levels, and that the easiest way to sort of appeal to these judges from all across the country, from all different experience levels, is really simple. I think it's actually just 2 really simple things. The first is that you should never underestimate the importance of just sounding like you are winning, and that in debates that are relatively close, and on a topic like this one, that is, it's very hard for one person to just run away with this topic because there are only a few core arguments that we'll talk about later, that ultimately just sounding like you're winning and just asserting that you are winning in some way, shape, fashion, or form, just by being confident, by sounding like a good speaker, that is the easiest way to get a bunch of judges to vote for you. Because even in debates where you think you could be losing on the flow, sometimes all it takes is just a little bit more confidence for the judge to vote for you. Because judges, as we talked about in our judge adaptation episode that you should listen to if you haven't already, really sometimes just use good confident speaking as a heuristic for determining who is winning this round. And once they figure out that they think that you're winning the round, they will look for reasons to vote for you. And that is the easiest way to get judges from every background to vote for you. The second thing that I would recommend is sort of just don't underestimate the importance of just telling a story. And I don't mean like a lullaby or like a bedtime story, something like that, but rather
Once upon a time, Lawrence won the NSDA tournament, and that's the end.
Yeah, it's about the only meaningful thing I've ever done in my life. Anyways, that you shouldn't just like make a bunch of arguments and let them float around in the debate, because judges don't want to do work, and you should do the work for your judges and piece together the arguments for the judges in a much more simple to understand way. And the way that I sort of explain this in an easier sense is that the last 30 seconds-ish of each of your speeches, be it the second negative rebuttal or the second affirmative rebuttal, should functionally be word for word what the judge writes on the ballot. And being able to sort of tell these very simple to understand stories that weave together all of the moving parts in a debate and puts them together in a very easy to understand and accessible manner for all types of judges is the easiest way to appeal to judges with different backgrounds. In general. The final last thing I'll talk about before I end my rant, because I'm sure none of you want to listen to my voice any longer than you have to, is that Nationals is a stressful tournament. So one of the things that you have to do when you're preparing for Nationals is recognize that it's going to be rough. So you're going to need to sleep. You're going to need to eat. My junior year, I stopped eating on day 3 of rounds. That was a terrible idea. I was basically dead by the end, and I was welcoming the sweet embrace of the end of the tournament. Like when I finally lost that last round and I was like out of the tournament, I was like, thank goodness I can go eat now. You don't want that to happen. Just recognize that Nationals is a long, stressful tournament, and you have to take the time to take care of yourself. Bennett Eckert, who won the tournament most recently this year or last year at Nationals, and I were interviewed by Victory Briefs, and there's an article on the Victory Briefs blog that you should read, and we talk a lot more about different ways to prepare for Nationals, and I hope that helps as well. So that is the end of my rant.
Okay, that was excellent. I learned a lot. Hopefully I can improve on my 5-7 record when I come back in the next life. When I'm reincarnated and stuff. So, Alex, did you ever attend the NSDA tournament?
Yeah, I did my sophomore year, and I'll say that I had a very similar experience to you. I did
Did I
not
beat you? Was it?
do
What was
what?
your record?
Honestly, I can't remember, to be honest.
Okay, I'm just gonna assume that it was better because I'm great.
Yeah, that's
And I
that's
need,
probably a fair assumption.
and if I don't feel superior to someone at any given time, I just can't go through life with any self-esteem. So I'm just gonna decide that I'm better than you.
Fair
However,
enough.
the amount that both of us are worse than Lawrence is so incredibly large. So what advice would you have for this tournament, or do you just wanna stick with what Lawrence has said?
Just a couple of things to add. One, as Lawrence was saying, the last 30 seconds of your speeches should be used to kind of clarify the debate, which means that crystallization is very, 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 very important. Um, I can tell you that I most likely lost most of my rounds while I was there because I was just incredibly bad at crystallization at the time. Because I may have been head on very small, like on a lot of different issues, but I couldn't articulate it into a story for the judge to vote on. So it's very important that, uh, regardless of the judge you get, if most likely you won't know the person who you are judging, that you are able to articulate it and come with a ballot story in the last 30 seconds or so. Another important tool that I like to use in a lot of lay rounds is at the start of speeches, just kind of um, at the start of rebuttals, using the first 20 seconds to kind of outline the path that the rebuttal is going to take. This is especially useful for the NR, mostly because it's a long speech, and a lot of times once you go into the substance of it, it's going to get very kind of nitty gritty at points. So giving your judge like a roadmap or kind of a way of how they're going to think through when you're going through each particular argument is really important before and after you're done going through the particular issues. And the final thing is something to kind of help you construct the story or to kind of sound more persuasive is sometimes just like using like rhetorical flourishes, I guess. This is something that I kind of learned through doing World Schools debate my senior year, which is a lot of people vote on rhetoric, and it's really important when you sound good or sound nice, I guess, at this tournament in particular. So if you're able to kind of create like a catchy like tagline or a catchy kind of like not necessarily slogan, but like a way to summarize what the thesis of your case is, then that can also help you get your point across and kind of have like a sort of way for the judge to keep in mind and remember some of your arguments or what exactly is going on in the debate.
That's definitely true, and I think those things are more prominent at this tournament than maybe at many of the other ones across the country. Okay, so now the second part of strategy is strategy on this topic generally. So there are a lot of different strategic issues that maybe we could go over. As someone who's as two people who are a lot more engaged with this literature than I am, I would like to that you all could take the lead on this. So what are arguments, not like particular arguments, but sort of just like global strategic choices that you would want to make going into this tournament on this topic? We'll start with Alex. What do you think is a good idea?
Okay, so there are kind of a couple of issues that you should kind of think through whenever you're constructing cases on this topic. So the first one is whether or not you want to take a more philosophical approach or more of a concrete approach to the questions being asked. And I don't think there's like a definitive answer, so to speak, on the question of whether or not you should be more abstract or more concrete. But something that's important to keep in mind is that the heart of the debate and what's going to appeal to a lot of judges here is some of the more abstract discussions, I think, and more like philosophical arguments that you can make. But I don't think that's a reason to be like abstract and kind of not abstract and incoherent. I mean, so I think that if you're able to supplement some of your philosophical arguments with concrete examples or concrete real world clashes, that provides like a lot of appeal to the judge to some extent, which is why I think that's like a particular strategic issue that's important to keep in mind when like adapting to judges.
Okay, Lawrence. Do you have something to add that is similar to what Alex said, or different, or do you just want to say some words and we can experience them for ourselves?
Yeah, so I'm personally for the sort of more philosophy-heavy approach, supplemented by concrete examples that like Alex was sort of hinting at. So the reason I think this is the case is because most of the sort of concrete examples approaches that people will take, and so the ones most obviously that affirmatives will reference are like specific rights to due process, specific rights to privacy, specific rights to free speech, and the ones that negatives will reference are specific national security examples of terrorism or the economy being damaged or international wars, domestic terrorism, things like that, all seem to beg the question of the values behind them in the first place. And and they would just be undermined by the other debaters sort of contesting the philosophical basis behind those arguments. And so I'll use the example that I'm most familiar with, which is privacy versus terrorism. So, can we violate some people's privacy in the hopes of solving, preventing a few terrorist attacks here and there? Well, when negative debaters make their entire contention or their entire negative case just about the importance of stopping terrorism, well, I think that begs the question of whether or not we value national security above civil liberties in a more abstract sense. Because if we don't, then the appeals to terrorism are just appeals to like saving lives, which is just an appeal to national security, or an appeal to like keeping people safe, or which is just like a more utilitarian approach to the philosophical basis of things. So if the negative case is just purely concrete example focused, well, it's going to lose all of these debates where the affirmative just contests the philosophical basis for these concrete examples. But the reason I think you should supplement with concrete examples is because just being purely abstract in your philosophical approach is a good way to lose judges who aren't on the same page as you. So grounding these more abstract philosophical positions in more concrete examples that people see manifested in the real world all the time, the most notable being privacy versus terrorism, I think is a good way to sort of have that middle ground of both approaches.
So those are two takes on strategy for the NSDA tournament. And when we get back, we're going to talk about 3 affirmative arguments and 3 negative arguments that you all can use at the tournament. So as usual, we're going to talk about 3 affirmative arguments and 3 negative arguments. So the first affirmative argument that's listed in our show notes is just freedom, autonomy, etc. And I don't exactly know what that means, so I'm going to defer to Lawrence and Lawrence on this one. What do you mean by freedom, autonomy, etc.?
So just like the general strand of thinking that justifies like why we care about civil liberties intrinsically, the other affirmative arguments we'll talk about are sort of more sort of side effects, I would guess. I'm not sure if that's the most accurate way of phrasing it, but sort of other reasons for why civil liberties are good beyond sort of their intrinsic groundings in a moral basis. So I think the general explanation for like why we care about civil liberties is because they are defenses of individual freedom and autonomy, because they prevent the government from unnecessarily intruding into your life and making it impossible to live a free life free from interference. So I think Alex is a pretty good philosophy person, so I'll let him take the lead on some of these arguments. But generally speaking, it's just like this is just the strand of arguments that are like, here's why civil liberties are good from a sort of philosophical perspective. So, Alex, you got some more nuanced defenses of why civil liberties are good?
Yeah. So one particular philosophical perspective you can kind of use to help develop some of these arguments is from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. So there are kind of 2 different areas you can draw from his philosophy. So first is from his political philosophy, and if you haven't read the book Force and Freedom by Ripstein, I would suggest that you would, because it's a nice book. But the starting point...
That's old Arthur, right? Arthur Ripstein?
Oh, Arthur Ripstein. So the starting point of Kantian political philosophy kind of begins with an explanation of the defects of the state of nature and how humans have an innate right of humanity. However, in the state of nature, Kant believes that there exists this innate right of humanity, but there are major defects that kind of prevent the realization of true freedom, because everyone exists within a relative state of unfreedom, since rights are not codified and ensured by an omnilateral will, which is just like the will of the many or a state to ensure those rights. So Kant holds that the primary obligation of states is to maintain a rightful condition that ensures a system of equal freedom for everybody. Now, the reason why philosophy becomes important for developing a strong argument for civil liberties is because the state is justified based on freedom and liberty and the innate value and right of humanity. So Ripstein would later argue that it would be a contradiction to enable one to create laws that would allow security to trump individual liberty, since this would contradict the innate right of humanity. So this would mean that states just don't have the authority to legislate one to make a greater sacrifice for greater security. And then the second place you can draw from Kantian philosophy is from his ethical and moral philosophy. And this one kind of deals with whether or not people should be treated as a means to an end or as ends in themselves. And so the argument here would be that civil liberties or violations of civil liberties is an example of someone being used as a means to an end, which this just means something as we're requiring one person to sacrifice for a greater good. And Kant argues that that is morally wrong on the basis of everyone has infinite value or unconditional value. So both of these arguments kind of provide like strong arguments for why freedom and liberty could not be trumped in the name of national security or some greater good.
So how would you think that like this argument, this freedom autonomy argument, what do you think is like, how much of this argument do you think we're going to see? Like relative to maybe other types of arguments, if you just had to give like a rough percentage.
So I would think that maybe like 35 to like 40-ish%. I don't know. I think that maybe the Kantian argument towards like why freedom is innately good or why freedom is necessary for the state may be less apparent because it requires kind of a more in-depth understanding of political philosophy. But I think that a lot of the arguments about why like the state can't contradict its foundational authority, which is from the freedom that the citizen or the state is an extension of individual freedom, and that the state can't contradict that authority, will probably appear more often. Maybe not in a Kantian form, but more so just in the idea that freedom is something important, and that since we cede some rights to the state, that doesn't mean the state can just do whatever it wants.
Yeah, so I also think this will be a relatively moderately moderately popular argument. I think most of the affirmatives will sort of at some point tangentially reference sort of the intrinsic value of civil liberties, although whether or not affirmatives will be able to present nearly as good a defense of them from a more nuanced philosophical perspective like Alex just did is sort of up for question. Even I sort of have trouble thinking about the proper way to phrase the justifications behind why civil liberties are good from a sort of freedom autonomy perspective. Even though I think we sort of intuitively understand the connection between them, I don't think most people are able to really effectively tell you the connection between them. But I do think that most affirmatives will invariably end up referencing some strand of civil liberties are what protect you against the state. That's like sort of the purpose of the state. Reference something about Kant. It'll probably happen one way or the other.
Okay, so let's move on to the second affirmative argument. This is listed as disparate impacts, and I do not know what you mean by this. So, Lawrence, you're just gonna have to take us away.
So disparate impacts. So just basically means that violations of civil liberties, if they were to occur, would affect certain populations more than others, and those populations would typically be considered those we consider marginalized or disadvantaged. I think Alex mentioned before this podcast that he did a specific section in his topic analysis about Islamophobia and how when civil liberties are sacrificed in the name of national security, it invariably results in an intensification of surveillance and a deprivation of civil liberties, specifically to Muslim Americans in the United States. And that would be considered unjust from a sort of equity-based perspective because it would allow the burdens of national security or civil liberties violations be shouldered mostly by groups that already experience marginalization in society. So the sort of best historical example of civil liberties being stripped from a particular population in the name of national security is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, where civil liberties were violated at the expense of national, or for the purpose of national security, but that laid most heavily on a disadvantaged group, which was Japanese Americans. I think Alex can more clearly elaborate on this in the context of Islamophobia.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good literature on in the context of the United States and Western countries in general, in terms of sacrificing civil liberties in the context of Muslim citizens. And one of the primary examples that the literature refers to in the context of the United States is the U.S. Patriot Act, and how it kind of justified a lot of disparate treatment among Muslim Americans. So the main crux of these arguments is that Western Islamophobia kind of constructs Muslims as inherently threatening to national security, and as such, the reaction by the U.S. is to create certain states of exception, or kind of gray areas that arbitrarily erode the rights of Muslims. So this kind of takes a couple of different forms. So the first one could be like arbitrary intrusions through its surveillance, based off of racial profiling. There's a lot of evidence about within the debate between surveillance and like whether or not the government can increase its surveillance tactics in order to prevent things such as terrorism, is that a lot of this surveillance is actually based off of like racial profiling. And so in this instance, we have the specific degradation of civil liberties in the context of like brown and Muslim Americans. And the second kind of context in which this kind of comes up is the disregard of due process and the prevention of cruel and unusual punishment in military prisons. So
military prisons?
Yeah.
Like what are those? Just like very generally.
So those are like prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, as well as there are other
prisons in other countries, to be clear.
Yeah, prisons in other countries
that are run by the United States military. Okay, go on.
Yeah, and so so in the context of due process, as I was saying a little bit earlier in this podcast, for a while, and I think it continues to be the case, that there was a suspension of due process rights for those suspected of terrorism, and they'd be tried in courts that were that basically did not abide by the same rules that other U.S. courts have to abide by. So, for instance, they wouldn't have access to representation. The trials weren't speedy. A bunch of other things that would basically skew decisions and would probably hurt people more, especially Muslim Americans, because there's already a presumption that they're threatening to national security. In the context of military prisons, there's like lots of evidence about just the abuses that goes on within those prisons. Like there have been various scandals in the context of the United States where there were photos released by that were leaked of like wardens in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay just like abusing the prisoners there, which basically kind of disregards the idea of preventing cruel and unusual punishment. And a lot of these are justified in the fact that, oh, well, they're not citizens, right? So this debate could kind of more focus on like the civil liberties of non-citizens in this context. And so I think that that is kind of an important way of talking about disparate impact. And the final way is there's also evidence that the United States constructs things such as immigration as a national security issue. And so a lot of immigrants also have their due process rights eroded within the context of like ICE and deportation hearings. And so this is just like another example in which the United States has kind of justified the erosion of civil liberties for particular groups. And so, like Lawrence was saying, you could kind of go with a more equity-based standpoint on reasons why we can't just like get rid of or just allow the erosion of civil liberties, because ultimately it falls on those who are already marginalized.
Okay. And what sort of criterion would you all recommend for something like this? Like, I know that there are like a fair number of options, but like, what is the one that for this tournament that you all would recommend that our listeners invest some time in?
So one particular convincing framework that I think people can, or debaters can argue for in front of the types of judges that you'll see at nationals will be a kind of like Rawlsian framework about justice as fairness or justice based in equality. And the way that this criterion would form or would be phrased is something like preventing arbitrariness of rights claims based on social position. And so the argument would just be that rights claims can't be contingent on some immutable factor of one's existence, or at least justice cannot be. So the argument would be that we have to take an approach that takes equality into account, and that doesn't allow for rights claims to just be arbitrarily enforced or arbitrarily exclude some people from having access to those rights claims.
Lawrence, what do you think is like the best criterion to use for a resolution like this?
Yeah, so my initial assumption is also Rawls, but I certainly think other frameworks that appeal to sort of respecting minority rights and equality would all be fine. So any just like basic respecting equality or maintaining democratic equality or something like that would be fine. It doesn't seem very difficult to sort of work up a theory of democracy that requires equality, and that arguing that minority oppression is problematic from a democratic standpoint, or at least the standpoint of a just government. That doesn't seem very difficult to work up an argument for. So either Rawls or just some simple equality democracy-based framework.
Yeah. So is just like oppression bad, like straight up? Like, is that one that you might want to use, or would you want to go through something like Rawls? Because I know that our current national champion, Bennett Eckert, has kind of suggested to just go straight up oppression bad sometimes.
So I personally don't actually recommend this approach, although certainly I can see why this approach is popular. So the reason I don't recommend it is because I think that a lot of the judges at nationals are less prone or like less receptive to sort of frameworks that sound like they've been stolen out of a policy critique back file. So I think that framing a lot of these oppression type arguments in a more sort of Enlightenment traditional philosophy sense is the better way to go in my mind, because it captures the benefits of talking about oppression from a moral standpoint for those types of judges, but for the more traditionalist type judges that prefer just listening mostly to Enlightenment era philosophy, it speaks to them as well. So instead of talking about like the good old Greenhill special Winter and Leighton card about structural violence being bad, I think it makes more sense to sort of talk about how, instead of structural violence being bad phrased as a more critical lens, it makes more sense to just talk about how inequalities are bad for democracy, and that violence against minorities is bad for democracy, and peel back just to sort of more traditional type values.
Okay, so you've heard it here first about what sort of criterions that you might want to adopt for this argument. And the final affirmative argument is listed in our notes as checks and balances. Alex, are you able to talk with us about the importance of checks and balances and why that might mean you should value civil liberties over national security?
Yeah. So I talk about this in my topic analysis, and the basic sets of claims or arguments that kind of fall underneath this umbrella regard civil liberties, which are intended to be like trumps against the government's ability to legislate and abridge fundamental freedoms. So the claims that the literature make is essentially that by allowing the government to overstep or kind of get around these laws that protect civil liberties, it entitles the state to violate these protections in more and more broad ways. That's something kind of known as a slippery slope argument, right? That if we allow one bad thing, it will allow more and more bad things later because it allows the government to just infringe on more and more rights. But this isn't the only argument within checks and balances. In addition, it's kind of argued that in particular counterterrorism provisions allow the executive to determine the balance between liberty and security, which circumvents the need for democratic input from citizens in the legislature, because we can see historically that a lot of the ways that the balance is understood in times of crisis, especially in times of terrorism, is set by the executive and not necessarily by the legislature or without democratic input of its citizens. So that could be another reason why maybe for democratic reasons, why it kind of violates the system of checks and balances. And it's also this relationship between the increased power of states and the erosion of separation of powers is kind of empirically correlated. And it's continued through the war on terror in the United States. There are actual studies that kind of talk about the way that separation of powers has been eroded in the context of some particular nations. And even if the violation initially appears like exceedingly small, it's hard to make this violation selective. So the state can just interpret this in more broad ways down the road. Because it can't, these sort of like retractions of civil liberties can't be like only specific to at-risk groups. So in terms of like framing these arguments too, and types of like frameworks that you might want to appeal to or ways of framing these arguments, you appeal to like ideas of legitimate governance. So the standard for this should appeal to the necessity for governments to have checks on state abuse. So, for instance, the U.S. Constitution acknowledges that governments are capable of unfairly persecuting individuals and thus establishes due process rights as a fundamental check. So this standard kind of respects the Constitution establishes that it's better to let some guilty persons go rather than convict an innocent. So the standard respects that hierarchy by placing checks on government above the protection of citizens from undue harm by other persons. So essentially, the criterion that you would use is just like preserving checks and balances within the government. But the way that you would phrase the framework would be something along the ideas of what it means to be a legitimate government or why good governments must abide by a system of checks and balances.
Lawrence, what do you think? What do you think about this?
Seems pretty comprehensive to me. I mean, I'll just add a few extra thoughts in here, make it short and quick. I think the easiest sort of way to appeal to judges in terms of the importance of checks and balances is that really that checks and balances are the single distinguishing feature between either between just government and either sort of a totalitarian government or just a mafia type rule. Because any like even the mafia, like when you paid them for protection, would give you sort of, I guess, national security, more likely in that sense, just like community security. But the difference between, no one wants to live underneath the mafia because the mafia can come in at any point in time and kill you, and that's not cool. And so the reason why we're okay living in the United States, which is arguably a more just government, is a just government and certainly a more just government than a mafia, is because the United States isn't going to come in and like send their military after you for absolutely no reason, because it's constrained. It has checks and balances. It's not going to violate your freedom. And so really the only difference between living in a totalitarian state or living under the rule of the mafia are checks and balances. And sort of appealing back to this is really important. I also think the sort of second other thing to throw in there is that when negatives are going to be like civil liberties are huge, they hugely hamper the ability of the United States or any just government to pursue national security. I think that's kind of silly because civil liberties are very, very minimum requirements upon a government that are established as sort of guarantees to the citizens, and that checks and balances, like, it's okay that we don't follow them perfectly all the time. But in the context of civil liberties, it is incredibly important that we adhere to these civil liberties and give them a high weight, because if we just continuously violate them all the time, well, we've undermined the most basic procedural constraints upon a government and undermined very much the core of the relationship between the people and the government. So I think that those are just two small things to add upon what Alex talked about, which I thought was like really comprehensive and nailed everything that we want to talk about of this argument.
All right. I think that was pretty comprehensive. So let's talk about negative arguments. The first negative argument is listed as social contract very generally. I assume that this is some argument that the social contract justifies the importance of national security, as in like that's the reason that the government was founded. Am I right, Lawrence?
Yeah, so I'll just talk about it broadly. I believe that Alex did more specific research on the Hobbesian approach to this topic. So I'll just generally talk about the social contract. So that was the episode that we talked about last week. So if you're unaware of sort of the more intricate areas of the social contract, it might be worth listening to last week's episode. The general way that the social contract would negate is just to prove that the very reason why we left the state of nature is to sacrifice to sacrifice some of our basic liberties for the sake of a government that is able to preserve our collective security, and that the very basis, the only reason for why a government would ever be just in the first place is its ability to preserve national security. And so to prevent a government from dissolving and being unable to fulfill its central purpose, you should allow the government the power to occasionally or even frequently override civil liberties for the purpose of preserving collective security. So the social contract remains a pretty straightforward moral and political justification for the existence of a state, and why the existence of the state is necessarily centered around preserving security. So I'll throw it over to Alex, who has a much more detailed approach to the Hobbesian social contract and how it relates to this topic.
So something important to understand about the Hobbesian or Hobbes's notion of the social contract is that it's a lot different than like the Lockean notion of the social contract and other notions of social contract that put liberty at the center of the state. Hobbes takes the opposite approach and kind of puts security as the ultimate goal and kind of the justification for the state. And so he kind of begins with an analysis of a condition that's known as the state of nature, which is just like a hypothetical situation, a state where there's a state of no governance, right? No governance. So Hobbes kind of begins in that state. So rather than having like an optimistic view of like the freedom and kind of like the things that people can do in this state, Hobbes kind of classically describes this as the state of nature as nasty, brutish, and short. What he means by that is essentially that everyone is inherently self-interested, and in the state of nature, there is not a sovereign to limit your right to anything. And so self-interest will ultimately conflict because it's unconstrained. And so the notion of justice and right is meaningless in this condition, since those things are only existent within the concept of the state. So in this instance, there's no means to adjudicate conflicts between individuals, and there's no way to kind of guarantee rights claims. So the institution of the sovereign has a dual purpose of securing and protecting individuals from each other, as well as act as the objective reason that mediates conflicts. Because Hobbes kind of regards reason as subjective between individuals, you need a judge to kind of mediate between those two individuals. So the sovereign is justified in the sense that it's able to provide security and protect individuals, and that individuals kind of act with self-preservation in mind. But the crux of Hobbes' argument relies on an absolute sovereign who's unlimited in their power when in the pursuit of protection of their sovereignty. Since the sovereign is established based off of this principle of self-preservation and protection, the sovereign's only duty is the preservation of its own authority to protect life. So the only principle that can limit the sovereign is when it acts contrary to self-preservation or its foundation for authority. So one example that Hobbes uses in the Leviathan is like the sovereign can't make you can't order you to kill yourself because the notion of individuals acting on self-interest and self-preservation, the sovereign is ordering something that's a contradiction with this idea of self-preservation, right? So that's kind of the justification of the state in Hobbes's account of the social contract. The way that national security kind of comes in, the debate between civil liberties and national security comes in, is that liberty cannot exist without security and a sovereign to ensure it. So liberty by necessity must take the back seat in the face of threats to national security, because the sovereign's only duty is the protection of its citizens and the protection of its ability to act as the arbiter between citizens. So while some of these claims might at first appear counterintuitive to like our modern notions of governance based on democracy, it's important to keep in mind that the only thing that the negative debater might need to win is that the defining feature of sovereignty is that protective relationship between subjects and their sovereign. As long as you win that
the fundamental duty of the state is security, then it's easier for you to leverage that against the affirmative, and you won't have to defend some of the more like fascist-y sounding implications of Hobbes.
So last episode, actually, we talked all about the Lockean social contract and its differences between the Hobbesian social contract, and a lot of those features are kind of shared between this episode and last episode. But I think the thing that it's important to emphasize here is that the Hobbesian social contract definitely justifies a national security-based approach over civil liberties. Right? The idea is, if you go through the work of justifying this Hobbesian thing, you have proven your side of the resolution pretty well. Is that right?
Yeah. Basically, the only thing that you kind of need to win is this sort of approach towards the justification of the state, which is the idea that self-preservation and security is the thing that founds the state. Much like how earlier I was talking about how the Kantian notion of the state, freedom is the foundation of it, and that kind of acts as a justification for why civil liberties are important. It's similar in this case, where Hobbes makes a claim that security and self-preservation are the foundational moment of the state.
Okay, so the second negative argument we have is that security is a prerequisite to other values. Lawrence, what do you mean by this?
So the age-old debate between security and freedom almost always devolves to something like, well, security isn't valuable if you don't have freedom, but you can't have your freedom if you don't have security. So this is that part of it, which is just basically like, well, security is a prerequisite for fulfilling other goods in your life, and that the enjoyment of civil liberties and is basically impossible in a world in which security is not at least somewhat adequately fulfilled. And I think there's sort of two layers to this argument. So the first one is like civil liberties themselves are sort of impossible to protect in a world in which national security does not exist. But the second layer to this is that the values that inform why civil liberties are important are also under increased threat in a world in which we cannot adequately guarantee national security. So, for example, the reason for why we think that freedom of speech is probably good is varied, but at least one of those justifications would include something along the lines of the ability to like freely express yourself is really good. Well, the ability to freely express yourself is pretty difficult to fulfill if you're dead, but also even in a world of national security threats that don't involve just everyone dying, it's pretty hard to fulfill that value if you're sort of just under constant threat of someone killing you or someone making your life substantially worse off. And so this means that we ought to prioritize national security when it comes in conflict with civil liberties, because it preserves the ability to pursue the values of civil liberties in the long run. I think this is sort of just part of the broader strand of analysis that argues for the importance of a right to life, and like we can talk more about that in a second, but just sort of like the right to life is important because it is a prerequisite to the enjoyment of other things like liberties. And so we can just sort of extrapolate that out to national security, and that national security is a prerequisite to enjoying civil liberties.
So what like framework would this be under? And Alex, you can maybe jump in and help me with this as well. But like, it sounds like these are kind of slightly disconnected logic-based arguments. Like, what is the framework that they would link to?
So in my mind, I deployed this argument my senior year because the negative on this topic was just the affirmative on the 2014 nationals topic. My criterion was like incredibly vague on purpose because I really did not ever want to have a framework debate on the affirmative. It was just something along the lines of maintaining consistency with governmental obligations, and the contentions were just like security is an important governmental obligation, and it was just these warrants for it basically. So I prefer to keep the criterion as vague as possible to avoid a negative engaging in an in-depth nuanced framework debate, because the negative had much more access to different philosophical positions on the 2014 topic. So that is my advice, is just some sort of like vague general type framework, but I'm sure that there are other ones. So you can incorporate this as part of the social contract argument. So one of the reasons we care about the social contract is that it protects the right to life, and that security is a prerequisite to accessing other values. I think any sort of those types of social contract theories would care about the right to life. Alex?
Yeah, I don't have much to add really. I would think that it's probably good to keep the, like Lawrence said, the framework vague in that context, because essentially these arguments are just reasons why security either comes as a logical prerequisite to the protection of civil liberties, or somehow security is necessary to actualize civil liberties. So I think that these arguments kind of only make sense in terms of either the social contract, like Lawrence was saying, or more vague, like this is what governments ought to be structured as, or watered down, governmental obligation type frameworks.
Okay, and then the last argument that I have listed here is just utilitarianism generally, and I gather that this is just the argument that national security, makes us the happiest when we don't get attacked by the terrorists or something. Lawrence, would you like to?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just it's, I guess, commonly known as util-trutil or something like that. But basically, that if we were to become utilitarians, that it would almost always prioritize national security above civil liberties, since national security, in a sort of consequence-based realm, would almost always be of greater impact to any person's well-being or suffering levels than civil liberties. That while violations of civil liberties would be a little bit bad for someone's well-being, that violations of national security would be really bad for someone's well-being. And so under a sort of consequentialist framework or utilitarian framework, we ought to care a lot about, we ought to care more about national security and prioritize that over civil liberties.
Okay, and Alex, do you have anything to add to this argument?
Not much. There's also a couple of different specific arguments that you can make in the context of the conflict between civil liberties and national security, such as terrorism and cybersecurity in particular. So there are a lot of arguments that that people in the literature make that say that sometimes we have to sacrifice some protections of civil liberties in order to prevent things like terrorism. So like I was talking about earlier, there are some people who justify that, for instance, we should get rid of some of the due process rights for those suspected of terrorism because it makes it easier for us to prosecute them. Now, whether or not that translates into less terrorism or us getting the bad guy, that's up for debate. But there are certainly other scenarios in which terrorism could come into play that requires a trade-off. So, for instance, surveillance, domestic surveillance in particular, in which there is a lot of arguments that say that domestic surveillance or more intense domestic surveillance is necessary to kind of get information that's necessary for stopping terrorism. And the second kind of vein of utilitarian arguments that I did some research on was cybersecurity. There are arguments that basically say that, well, first of all, the issue of cybersecurity is something that's really complex generally. So it might be hard to kind of talk about it within the context of debate round, especially if you have to go into the nitty-gritty details of it. But some measures to improve cybersecurity actively trade off with civil liberties. For instance, the method of data mining and some surveillance techniques have been proven effective, despite the risk they pose to things such as privacy. In addition, the risk posed by a coordinated attack of cyber terrorism to the United States in particular is a kind of big threat, especially to our infrastructure. So in terms of the big consequence, I guess, of this argument, it has both a high risk and a high magnitude scenario, I guess. But something that may be hard in winning this argument is why these methods are either effective or necessary. But yeah, other than that, I think that Lawrence's argument about why under consequentialism it would always prioritize maybe it would always prioritize national security. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that that can be an argument you can add into these situations in specific scenarios as an additional reason for why, if you lose like an argument about why like the for instance, if you're reading like reasons why terrorism could be stopped by trading off with civil liberties, that an additional argument about like as a principle, consequentialism would justify the pursuit of national security over civil liberty, that can also complement these cases.
All right. So this podcast is already running a little long. So that's 3 AF arguments, 3 neg arguments. And if you'd like any more information on any of these arguments, send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to provide you with some resources. Now on to the end segment. Well, that's the episode for this week. Thank you all for staying until the bitter end of the podcast and for sticking around for our mini debate. Couple things before we wrap up. First of all, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Alex. We really appreciated it. You know so much about this topic, and your insight was really important. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, but thank you more.
Okay.
Okay. There we go. That's good. And so second thing, thank you again to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast. Sign up for their camp. Definitely read that article that Lawrence was mentioning with 2 national champions talking about how to be national champions. That's legit. And one of the guys who runs Victory Briefs was a national finalist. So really, Victory Briefs is just full of national champions, and they would love to have you there to learn from them. And again, be sure to like our Facebook page at The Argument Clinic. Send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so mini debate, real quick before we go. So in my the most important segment of the podcast, so I'm going to do, and I don't really have a good answer to this question, but I think it's a cool question. Best flower. So I'll start as Lawrence comes up with an answer. I think I actually do have an answer to this, but I almost certainly forgot it, which means that it can't be that important to me. However, I do really enjoy the look of sunflowers, especially large quantities of sunflowers together. And they're like really big and pretty and stuff, and like yellow, and like that's cool. So I'm gonna put in my vote for sunflower. Lawrence, what do you got for me?
Wait, there are different types of flowers?
Yeah. Your favorite flower?
Oh,
no, not your favorite flower. The best flower. Best flower. We're objective here at the Argument Clinic.
Shoot, I haven't had enough time to research this.
Research?
I was unaware of that, like, of how many different flowers in the world there were.
Did you just Google like flower types or something and just
yes?
Like, them? Jesus Christ, come on!
Yes, there's so many of them.
You're such a degenerate. I'm gonna go to Alex.
Yeah,
and then
please.
As he's doing that, you can find some article that some flowers are good for your health or something. But like, I mean,
Okay.
all right, Alex. Best flower. I don't know if there's many flowers in Texas, but
The best flower by far, or at least my favorite flower that I will argue is the best, are snapdragons. Because they
what?
kind of look
I'm gonna Google that. What? How do you spell that?
snapdragons, just
Snapdragon?
Yeah, snapdragons.
Okay. All right. Talk. Okay. I'm looking at them. They're like fine. B minus.
Yeah. So they're really colorful. They come in all different kinds of colors. They come in like kind of like a pinkish color, a whitish color, yellow color. So we got all the colors of the spectrum going on there. Also, they kind of look like dragons, apparently. That's why they're called it. So
they really don't.
They don't, but I
They're
think
definitely not. Also, most of the pictures, well, not most of them, like 40% of the pictures for when I Google image Snapdragon are an app called Snapdragon.
Ooh, that's rough.
Some like computer thing. How about sunflower? If I just Google sunflowers, it's going to be some stupid app. Sunflower. Nope, they're just actual sunflowers.
Wow. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I feel like my Google, like, I got so many flowers. I don't see the Snapdragon app. Is there a Snapdragon app?
Dude, I just searched Snapdragon, and that's literally like a lot of the images. In fact, it's the first one. Qualcomm Snapdragon or whatever.
Oh, whoa.
Oh yeah, the Qualcomm processors. Yeah, they're just used in all the phones.
Okay. Well, I do not accept your answer of Snapdragon is okay. It's mitigated by the fact that it's also a computer thing. It doesn't
I think that's like a benefit to Alex's
what, like
flower.
someone like made an app with its name. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure there is a sunflower app. Yeah, there just definitely is. And the sunflower app has been used in logos and whatever. There are also a bunch of pictures with like baby heads photoshopped into sunflowers. Probably some app that does that. Anyway, Lawrence, you've had enough time to stew on your answer.
I have to answer? No, I forfeit this one.
You forfeit? Okay. At least.
Hey! I won an NSDA national. So I should be allowed.
This
I should
is
be
an
allowed.
easy question. You can't even pick a flower. Come on. Oh my god. All right.
Whenever I feel bad about losing a debate about flowers, I'll just look over into the corner of my nationals trophy.
Oh! I just got roasted.
Roasted.
Oh man, I just got destroyed. All right, well, I think that's a pretty good place to end the episode for this week. So thanks for hanging out with us till the end, and stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.